Hello, the Divine Code reading for November 14th, pages 319 and 320. We are in the chapter, The Prohibition of Separating Meat from an Animal that is lived of dying, and restrictions on consuming such meat after the animal's death. Topic number 9. Animal is killed as food for Gentiles. And we saw in the last couple of days reading that there's a difference between if the animal is slaughtered for a Gentile, or if the assumption is for Gentiles, or if the assumption is for a Jew. There's slightly different nuances to the laws. If the animal is killed as food for Gentiles, it may first be rendered unconscious by electric shock or the like. But if its reflexes and breath cease, this does not prove that it has died, since it may wake up. It may afterwards wake up from a stunned condition. For non-kosher slaughter, the main artery in the animal's neck should be cut. It's not required, but it should be cut, so it will bleed out. Even if a strong electronic shock is applied to kill the animal by cardiac arrest, versus merely to facilitate the slaughter or to render the animal insensitive. So chickens are often slaughtered by passing them through water with electric current, and the water with the electric kills the chicken, and that's why we find blood blotches in the chicken's flesh sometimes from the electric shock, and that's usually considered sufficient to kill the chicken. It's suggesting here in this case it should also have its neck cut, just to make certain that it is in fact dead. Versus merely to facilitate the slaughter or render the animal insensitive. A further foolproof method means such as decapitation or complete bleed out is needed before skinning and butchering begins, so that the heart has permanently stopped pumping, after which the animal is considered dead, even if its heart fibrillates for a few additional minutes. So the heart pumping is what's considered the animal being alive. The electric shock, normally it just stuns the animal, so it's insensitive to the pain. How it's considered humane, I'm not sure, but if they might shock the animal to make it insensitive to pain, and then kill the animal. Or in the case of a chicken, they might kill it with the electrical shock, but it's still a good idea to cut off its head just to make sure it is in fact dead. If the heart, after it stops pumping, is still vibrating a little bit, but it's not doing the pumping, it's considered dead at the point that it stops pumping, even if it continues to vibrate. I'm sorry. Khatim Sofer Yeridea, chapter 339. A long period of stop breathing is not proof of death for humans. See Igrit Moshe, Yeridea, volume 2, 146. So we learn this is concerning the laws of murder, that just because a person stopped breathing does not mean that he's dead. Even if he stopped breathing, he was considered dead. Similarly, because we're dealing with the animal aspect of it, similarly, the animal is not considered dead even if it stopped breathing for a couple minutes. That's not the definition of death. It's death can be assured by making an open cut through a major vein or artery and waiting until it has stopped bleeding vigorously. Dr. Temple Grandin, a leading humane slaughter expert, shared the following points in an online public discussion on April 23rd, 2002. If an animal is, the heart will be stopped. The Humane Slaughter Act, that's the United States, the Humane Slaughter Act states that the animal must be in a state of surgical anesthesia. In normal slaughter, the animal is bled out and the heart will stop. Ideally, the animal should be bled out for about 5 minutes. One of the most important factors to ensure a good bleed out is the skill of the person doing the bleeding. In large plants with a powered chain, there is an enforced bleed time. Small plants. So the animal is bled out basically by slicing the artery, and the blood is for as long as the heart is pumping, and that causes the blood to leave, and the heart then stops, and the animal is then considered dead. Slaughterhouse, they have it's called the chain time. It's the animal at this point is up, it's hanging from a chain, and the chain is kind of working through heading towards the factory, the assembly line, or in this case, the de-assembly line of the animal, to cut it up. It's heading in that direction, but it takes a certain amount of time. And the factory or the slaughterhouse will assure that the animal takes a certain period of time, because it's all mechanical. They know it's going to take a certain amount of time before it gets to the slaughtering area or to the butchering area. So that's enforced. As long as the cut was made properly, it's an enforced amount of time. A smaller butcher house is not going to have a chain, have a mechanically thing. It'll be more humans pushing it along on pulleys, and therefore they have to be more careful with a smaller slaughterhouse to make sure that the timing is done correctly. They give it sufficient time. A small plant must be very careful to allow the animal to completely bleed out prior to skinning or leg removal. An animal can return to sensibility during bleeding. If bleeding is poorly done, this is why the plant management needs to supervise and do internal quality audits on animal handling and stunning. Problem with sticking, that's for bleed out, is making an opening that is too small when the heart is stopped. Body movements can still occur. Even when the head is removed, there is no humane slaughter regulations for poultry in the U.S., although there are voluntary industry guidelines. So there's regulation regarding mammals, sheep and cows and that, or beef and that, are going through a plant. There's government regulations saying this is how you have to do it. And there needs to be internal audits, and there needs to be an awareness on the part of the plant management, the slaughterhouse management, that they're keeping track of this to make sure that it's done properly. It can be made, especially if you're under pressure to keep it moving. I mean, time is money, and what's the purpose of waiting a couple extra minutes? Well, there is a need to wait, and there's a need to do things correctly. And it's important to have government regulations to make sure that they're doing it correctly. Or in the case of chicken, they have to make sure that there's industrial. So there should be government regulation as well in the chicken industry, in the poultry industry. But that's mostly voluntary industry guidelines, and it's important that it be done correctly, especially because chickens deal with electrical stunning rather than proper slaughter techniques. Topic number 10. When the head of an animal has been severed, as its esophagus, windpipe, spine, and veins have been cut through, even though it is the trunk by the skin, the animal is certainly dead, even though its heart continues beating for several minutes. The prohibition against eating the meat or organs removed from the living animal does not apply to it in this condition. Mishnah Oholat, Chapter 1, Tractate Kulin, 21a, and Rashi there. Rambam, Laws of Sources of Ritual Impurity, beginning in chapters 2 and 4. The case denotes complete death, and the animal is not considered so apparently, even though at this point, this is where the whole thing gets tricky. At this point, it's had its head severed. And the important parts of the head at least have been severed. And maybe some of the meat, some of the skin might still be there, but that's not considered important in this regard. The head has been severed with all of its important parts. The animal is considered dead. Now, theoretically, person could start harvesting the meat. They could start slaughtering the meat, or at this point, even though the heart is still pumping. So apparently, the heart being disconnected from the head is an important factor in all this, even if the heart is still pumping. So if that's the sole criteria, then the animal would not. If the heart pumping is the sole criteria, then the meat would not be appropriate at that point. But apparently, it is possible to take the meat off at that point. Pumping. So there's obviously more to it than just looking at the heart pumping. Topic number 11. It has been previously explained that if flesh is removed from an animal while it is convulsing in its death throes, the flesh is forbidden for Gentiles to eat. Therefore, if flesh is removed from an animal while it has any of the following conditions apply, it remains forbidden to be eaten forever. So we know that the forever is rabbinic, but to understand how these are, whether or not the animal is considered alive or dead. We just saw that in the previous topic that severing the head is considered, the animal is now considered dead, even though the heart is pumping. So these are conditions where the animal would not be considered dead, even though we might think that it would be, but they're not. The animal's not considered dead yet. A, if the animal's backbone was broken at the base of the neck, with most of the flesh of the neck torn, but the head is not totally severed, that is, the windpipe, the esophagus, and most of the veins are still intact. So if part, the head is still attached as far as the living aspects of the head, the esophagus and the veins in that, the windpipe, the esophagus, and the veins, the arteries in that are still attached, still considered connected to the body, even though the backbone has been severed. That's not the critical issue. Before we saw if the head, all these parts are taken off, the head is considered severed. But if if the critical aspects are still there, then the head is still considered attached. B, if the body was cut in two halves. Now, it's not really explained in here where the cut is occurring. I assume that this is like across the torso, so the back half is severed from the front half. Through the middle, then the heart would obviously stop pumping if the heart is cut in half. But if the animal is cut in half, that is you cut across the stomach area, that it's still alive, at least for a few minutes, and the heart is still pumping. That animal is still considered alive, and therefore meat removed at that point would be forbidden. And then there'd be the question of would the part that was cut in half, would that meat ever be prohibited? Would that meat also be prohibited because it was considered flesh from a living animal at that point? That topic is not addressed here. But basically, the animal is still considered alive at that point. C, if a thigh and the adjoining socket were removed. So there, an entire leg has been removed from the animal. That again is not going to prevent. The animal is still alive, even though it's pretty torn up. It's still alive. D, if it is torn from the inside. So basically, this is like the animal got caught in a farm machinery and it's ripped apart, like it's really torn up. And this is the language from the Rambam, which appears to mean that the animal's back was torn with the spine detached from the body. Pretty ripped apart, but the heart is still beating. The animal is still considered alive because the heart is still beating. That part is still functioning. In each of these cases, even though the animal has no chance of living more than several minutes, as long as its head is beating, its flesh is forbidden to be removed. As long as its heart is beating, its flesh is forbidden to be removed. Rambam, the laws of ritual slaughter 3:19, and the laws of sources of ritual impurity beginning, which indicate that in such cases the animal is considered dead while it is still alive, and it is forbidden. Rambam Zalman Nehemiah Goldberg notes that since such a case is considered ritually impure by Jewish law, carcass, so it is considered dead for a Gentile, just like the animal is in its death throes. However, the author notes that since the animal is still alive in a practical sense, according with topic 3.2, any meat removed from these circumstances is forbidden to be eaten by a Gentile forever. So, in a certain sense, in the area of ritual impurity, the animal is considered dead, even though its heart is still beating. But it's still alive because the heart is still beating. It's still alive, and therefore removal of meat. But it's in a complex area. That's why it's difficult to say if the animal is cut in half. Is the part that was cut half off of it, is that considered meat from a living animal? Which does not appear to be. The details of that is not in the divine code because it's a very complex matter, and it's something that normally doesn't happen. But if meat is taken from the animal in a deliberate sense, then it would be clearly under at least the rabbinic argument of prohibited because it was done deliberately. But if the meat is part of what was cut in half or a severed leg or something like that as part of the death, that would require further explanation because it doesn't. I don't think it goes into that in the divine code. Let me see. One more paragraph here. If a Gentile did sever a meat from an animal while it is in the above conditions, it is forbidden to eat that meat even after the animal dies. But one is not guilty of a capital sin in this situation. So the animal, because we know it's not a capital sin, that indicates a violation at this point. So the animal is considered dead for that sense, but it's the rabbinic aspect, it's the fence, where they make it forbidden, the meat's forbidden forever. Area of the animal cut in half or ripped apart like a fish or such it is still under the rabbinic prohibition, and it should be designated as forbidden. I would suggest, as part of the rabbinic prohibition, that even the meat that was separated as part of the killing of the animal, that led to the killing of the animal, the meat from the limb from the socket, or the animal is cut in half. Obviously, there's parts of the flesh that probably should be under the rabbinic ruling too, but it's not designated clearly in the divine code, and it's sort of a gray area at that point. But if somebody takes a piece off on purpose, that's clearly would fall under at least the rabbinic. That would be clear if it's done on purpose. But if it's done through like a farming accident, then it's not clear from this. So that would be if it's killing the animal in the process, if those parts would be forbidden. If a Jew cuts a meat from the animal in this condition for his own need. Now, obviously, the Jew's not making it for, he's not going to cook the meat. He's not going to eat the meat, but it's for some other purpose that he's doing that. He's planning to turn into fertilizer, and instead he sells it to the Gentile. That's permitted. It appears the Gentile may eat from the meat after the animal dies. So the animal is torn apart like a fish, and there's meat kind of scattered all over the place. Or the Jew cuts a piece off of the animal at this point before the animal dies, fully dies. Take a piece of meat off for his own use, for fertilizer, whatever he's going to do with it, and the Gentile may eat that meat after the animal dies. See topic 3.5 above. If a Jew cuts off meat from an animal on his own consumption, it's for the Gentile to eat after the animal dies. And this, but it would still be the similar rule. Thank you.